In the year 1260, the world trembled beneath the hooves of the Mongol horsemen. From the steppes of Central Asia, they had thundered westward, burning cities, crushing armies, and rewriting the map of the known world. No empire, neither the mighty Khwarezmians, nor the Caliphate of Baghdad, nor the kingdoms of Georgia and Armenia, had survived their storm. To resist them was to vanish. We used to hear the earth shake before we saw them. One Syrian chronicler later wrote, "The sky would darken with their arrows, and our hearts would turn to ash." For more than half a century, the Mongols had been the very symbol of inevitability, an unstoppable tide of horsemen, led by men who considered mercy a weakness. Their empire stretched from the Yellow Sea to the banks of the Danube. Cities that defied them were erased, their rulers impaled on the gates they had sworn to defend. When word came that the Mongols were marching on the Middle East, few believed anything could stand in their way. In 1258, Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, fell. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled for over 5 centuries, was extinguished in a single horrific week. The Tigris ran black with ink from the libraries thrown into the river, and red with the blood of its citizens. 500,000 people were said to have died. The Caliph himself was trampled to death beneath Mongol horses, a symbol that the old order of Islam had been crushed. "We saw the smoke for 3 days," wrote Ibn al-Fuwati, a survivor. "The city screamed as if the world itself was ending." After Baghdad, the Mongols advanced through Syria. Aleppo burned. Damascus surrendered. One after another, the cities of the Levant bowed or perished. Nothing seemed able to stop them until they reached the borders of Egypt, the last great Muslim power left unbroken. Egypt in 1260 was ruled by a new kind of dynasty, the Mamluks. Unlike hereditary kings, these rulers were former slaves, warriors bought as boys from the Turkic steppes or the Caucasus, trained in the arts of war and loyalty, and then freed to serve. Their entire system was built on merit, discipline, and survival. They were men who had already lost everything once and would not lose again. Their leader was Sultan Saif ad-Din Qutuz, a man forged in exile and betrayal. Captured by Mongols as a youth, he had been sold into slavery, trained as a Mamluk, and risen through sheer will. He understood the Mongols in a way few others did, both their methods and their arrogance. "They think fear wins every war," Qutuz is said to have told his commanders, but fear can also be turned against them. When news reached Cairo that the Mongol general Kitbukha, one of Hulagu Khan's most feared lieutenants, had marched into Palestine with perhaps 20,000 men, Qutuz called his council. Hulagu himself had withdrawn east, summoned by the great Khan's death in Karakorum, but his army remained, blood-hungry and certain of victory. They sent a demand to Qutuz: "Submit, or Egypt will burn." Qutuz answered not with ink, but with steel. He had the Mongol envoys executed and their heads displayed at the gates of Cairo, a declaration that this would be no surrender. Every citizen of Egypt knew what that meant. The Mongols were coming. The Mamluks began to gather their forces. From Cairo to Damietta, from Alexandria to the Nile Delta, soldiers, archers, and cavalrymen assembled beneath the crescent banner. Many had never fought a Mongol before, but all had heard the stories. They prepared as if for Judgment Day. Yet what Qutuz understood, and what few generals before him had grasped, was that the Mongols' greatest weapon was not their bows or horses, it was terror itself. They won because armies broke before fighting them. So his first task was to strip that fear away. He spoke to his men not as a king, but as a brother in arms. "Hebrew, you have heard the tales," he said before the march. "You have seen cities fall, but today the earth will hear of you. They call themselves the wrath of God. Then let us show them what happens when men of faith do not run." In early September 1260, the Mamluk army crossed the Sinai Desert and entered Palestine. They marched north toward Gaza, following the line of ancient trade routes that had carried prophets and conquerors for millennia. Along the way, The Mongols, confident and cruel, advanced to meet them. Kitbukha Noyan was no ordinary commander. He was a Christian Mongol of Nestorian faith, fiercely loyal to Hulagu Khan and unflinching in battle. He believed his army, though smaller, could crush any foe. To him, Egypt was simply another prize to be taken. "The Khan's shadow falls over all lands," one of Kitbukha's captains boasted. "The Nile itself will run east to serve us." But the Mamluks had a hidden weapon. A weapon not of iron, but of understanding. They had spent years studying the Mongol style, the feigned retreat, the lightning strikes, the encirclement. They would turn these same tactics back upon their masters. Qutuz's right hand, the young general Baybars, proposed a plan that would rely on deception as much as courage. They would feign weakness, lure the Mongols into a narrow valley near the village of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, and there strike with the full might of their cavalry. The stage was set, a small valley in Galilee, ringed by hills and green fields, where ancient legends said David had once slain Goliath. Now another giant would fall. I looked at the valley and felt the weight of history, a Mamluk archer later wrote. If David found his courage here, then so would we. The morning sun of September 3rd, 1260, rose over Ain Jalut. Both armies stood ready. The Mongols believed the day would end in fire and slaughter. The Mamluks believed it would end in deliverance. No one knew that within hours, the legend of Mongol invincibility would be shattered forever. We tightened the reins, one Mamluk chronicler remembered, and whispered our prayers. If we were to die this day, let it be with our faces to the enemy. The valley of Ain Jalut lay quiet before the storm. Morning mist hung low, and the only sound was the clatter of bridles and the distant calls of herdsmen driving pack animals toward the rear lines. Both armies had reached the plain, but neither had struck. The silence itself was heavy, as if the land were waiting to see who would master it. The Mamluks made their camp first. Their force was not vast, but it was professional in every sense of the word. Historians estimate it numbered between 15 and 20,000 men. Perhaps 10,000 of them trained cavalry, the rest foot soldiers, engineers, and archers on foot. Each Mamluk was a soldier by birth of circumstance, purchased as a child, raised in barracks, drilled until obedience and precision were second nature. Their lives had been shaped by discipline. The Mamluk cavalry was their pride. They rode strong Arabian and Turco-Cuman horses, bred for endurance rather than speed, capable of marching 50 kilometers a day under armor. Each horseman carried 2 bows, a quiver of 30 to 40 arrows, a long lance for shock charges, and a curved saber, the forerunner of what Europeans would later call the scimitar. The steel of their blades was forged in Damascus, folded and tempered until it could slice through mail without bending. Their armor was layered. First, a thick quilted coat, then mail or small lamellar plates sewn onto leather, and over that a light surcoat, marked with the color of their regiment. Helmets were conical, with chain veils to guard the neck. The best of them carried round shields of wood and hide, light enough to deflect arrows but broad enough to catch a sword stroke. Each Mamluk horseman also cared for his mount, with ritual devotion. The animals were fed barley mash and dates, their hooves checked at dawn and dusk. A lame horse was a death sentence in battle, so no man neglected the creature that would carry him to glory or the grave. Among them rode the Sultan himself, Qutuz, flanked by his officers. Near him was Baybars, younger, restless, and sharp-eyed, the architect of the plan to come. They moved through the camp inspecting ranks, speaking not as distant rulers but as comrades. When the muezzin's call rose for the dawn prayer, thousands of warriors turned their faces toward the east, their armor glinting pale gold in the first light. On the opposite side of the valley, the Mongol camp stirred. Smaller in number, perhaps 10 to 12,000, Yet fearsome in reputation, Kitbukha's men represented the finest of the Ilkhanate vanguard. They were veterans of a dozen campaigns: Baghdad, Aleppo, Homs. They had seen cities burn and kings fall. No one among them believed they could lose. Each Mongol warrior was both archer and horseman, drilled from childhood to shoot accurately at full gallop. Their composite bows were masterpieces of steppe craftsmanship, made from layered horn, wood, and sinew, with a draw weight far exceeding any simple wooden bow. A skilled archer could fire 6 aimed shots in a minute and hit a target at 200 meters. Their arrows came in sets, heavy broadheads for armored foes, narrow bodkin points to pierce mail, and lighter shafts for distance volleys. For close combat, they carried curved sabers or straight blades, a small battle axe, and often a lasso for pulling enemies from horseback. Their armor was lighter than that of the Mamluks, lacquered leather or scale armor that allowed flexibility. Helmets were iron or hardened leather, with fur padding underneath to soften the impact of blows. Each man had at least 2 spare horses, ensuring speed and stamina that few armies could match. The Mongol command structure was precise. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, the decimal system that had made their empire efficient and disciplined. Every order passed down from Kitbukha was obeyed without hesitation. Signal flags and curved horns communicated movements across the field. Drums beat in rhythm to keep formations tight even amid chaos. Behind the Mongol lines, their engineers tended to carts carrying provisions, spare arrows, and tools for siege work. They also kept strange barrels and bronze tubes, relics of the technology the Mongols had brought west from China. Chroniclers later wrote that the Mamluks heard explosions at Ain Jalut, possibly the sound of early gunpowder weapons called midfa, hand cannons that expelled a blast of smoke and fire. Whether they were truly used that day remains uncertain, but the knowledge of such devices was spreading, and both armies feared their thunder. In the Mamluk camp, the foot soldiers prepared their defenses. They carried long spears, bows, and round shields of wicker covered in hide. Some had crossbows imported from Europe through trade, though these were few. They formed the steady line that would anchor the cavalry's maneuvers, a wall of men trained to stand fast against charges. Behind them, the camp followers tended to the wounded from earlier skirmishes and carried water skins to the front. The air was thick with the smell of oiled leather, sweat, and horses. Men murmured prayers under their breath. Others sharpened blades on whetstones, the rasping sound steady as breathing. In every corner of the camp, blacksmiths hammered out dents from helmets, tightened saddle girths, and fitted new bowstrings. The rhythm of preparation was almost soothing, masking the fear that sat quietly in every stomach. Among the cavalry, some veterans spoke of earlier battles, of how the Mongols encircled their enemies with lightning speed, how they feigned retreat only to return like a storm. The younger Mamluks listened carefully. Their commanders had drilled them in countermaneuvers, to hold formation under feigned retreats, to resist the impulse to chase. Every man understood that discipline would decide the day more than bravery alone. Qutuz knew the strength of his army lay in its unity. Unlike the fractured Muslim forces that had fallen before the Mongols in Baghdad or Syria, his men were bound by loyalty, not tribe or bloodline. Slaves turned soldiers, soldiers turned rulers. They had built a system where skill outweighed birth. That was their hidden advantage, a weapon no one could see until it struck. Across the field, Kitbukha studied the terrain. The valley stretched 3 kilometers long, with low ridges perfect for ambush or maneuver. He noted the stream that ran through the center, the patches of grass where horses could graze, the narrow exits that might trap a fleeing army. To him, it was a perfect killing ground. He intended to draw the Egyptians in, crush them quickly, and move on to Cairo before Hulagu returned from the east. The sun climbed higher. The distance between the two armies shimmered with heat. Trumpets sounded as both sides aligned their ranks. Mongol banners of black and scarlet waved above the dust, On the other side, the green and gold standards of the Mamluks rippled in the morning breeze. For a brief moment, all movement stopped. Tens of thousands of men, horses, and weapons stood in stillness, facing one another across the plain. They had come from worlds apart, the steppes of Asia and the deserts of Egypt, yet they shared the same heartbeat of anticipation. In that silence, each man knew the next dawn would belong to only one side. The horns of the Mongols sounded first, a deep, rolling note that spread across the plain and was answered by the thunder of drums. Horses stirred, men straightened in their saddles, and the still morning air broke into movement. It was the kind of sound that made even the bravest tighten their grip on the reins. From the Mamluk line, Baybars gave the order to advance scouts and light cavalry. They rode ahead in small groups, archers ready, testing the distance and drawing the Mongol vanguard out of the haze. The two sides now stood less than a kilometer apart. Each army arranged itself with deliberate care. Qutuz formed his men in the traditional Mamluk pattern, 3 lines. The first consisted of light cavalry and skirmishers, trained to harass the enemy and then fall back. Behind them, the main force, heavy cavalry in close ranks, shields overlapping, lances upright like a forest of spears. The third line held the reserve, 1,000 elite horsemen hidden behind the ridges on both flanks, concealed until the moment of need. The Mongols adopted their own familiar crescent formation, curved wings ready to envelop, the center slightly withdrawn to bait the enemy forward. They had used the same shape from Korea to Hungary and had never failed to turn an opponent's eagerness against him. At Kitbukha's signal, 1,000 riders detached from the left flank and began to sweep wide, searching for a weakness. The ground between them was open and smooth, ideal for mounted combat. Dust hung in the air, stirred by hooves and wind. Somewhere far behind, the camp followers and grooms gathered spare horses, whispering prayers that the riders they served would return. The first arrows came from the Mongol side, hundreds of them, loosed in one rolling volley that whistled through the morning air. The Mamluks answered almost instantly, their own archers rising in their stirrups and returning fire. The sky between them shimmered with shafts that crossed midair and fell like rain. For minutes, it continued, wave after wave of archery. Horses reared, men ducked behind shields, arrows struck the ground in rapid thuds. It was a contest of skill and nerve, the ancient language of steppe warfare where every motion mattered. The Mamluks had trained for this. They did not waste their arrows. Their bowstrings sang in rhythm, guided by instructors who shouted corrections even amid the storm. To the Mongols, this was familiar territory. They advanced by degrees, their horses trotting in disciplined arcs, each rider firing before wheeling away to reload. The feigned retreat was their craft, perfected through centuries. Baybars watched them carefully. He knew the Mongols' strength lay not only in weapons but in rhythm, attack, withdraw, lure, and encircle. He instructed his men to hold the line, not to chase, no matter how tempting it seemed. To break formation was death. Behind the front ranks, the heavy cavalry waited. These were men who had fought in Syria, who had faced crusaders and Bedouin raiders, but never the Mongols. Sweat rolled down their faces beneath their helmets. They could hear the clash of arrows on armor and the cries of wounded horses. Every few seconds, a rider would fall, and his companion would close the gap without a word. Qutuz moved along the line on horseback, his sword unsheathed, calling to his men to stay firm. "Hold until you see their flanks," he shouted. His voice was rough from dust, but it carried weight. The Mongol center pushed forward, loosing arrows at closer range. Their horses, smaller and faster, darted through the gaps. A group of 10 riders galloped out to test the Mamluk front, firing rapidly before turning in unison and pulling back. The maneuver looked effortless, an invitation to chase. A few Mamluk soldiers shifted in their saddles, itching to pursue. Baybars raised his hand sharply, signaling restraint. He had learned from years of study that patience was the weapon the Mongols could not defeat. The exchange of fire lasted longer than anyone expected. Arrows ran low. Dust coated armor and faces, and visibility dropped to a blur of shadows. The sound was deafening. Hooves pounding, bowstrings snapping, the screams of horses struck mid-gallop. In the center, the Mamluk infantry braced themselves. Spears angled forward, shields locked. Behind them, rows of archers fired over their heads in steady rhythm. The infantry's task was simple: hold the ground, protect the cavalry's rear, and never allow a gap to open. They had trained for this moment for months, drilled to remain still even as death flew overhead. The Mongols now shifted tactics. Kitbukha sent his right wing forward at full gallop. Hundreds of horsemen spread into a loose line, bows firing, drums pounding. Their aim was to stretch the Mamluk formation and find a weakness along the edge. Baybars responded by moving part of his reserve quietly along the flank, ready to strike if the Mongols overcommitted. As the cavalry passed, the air thickened with smoke. Some chroniclers later wrote that both sides may have used small gunpowder tubes, the early Midfay weapons known in Arabic sources, primitive hand cannons that emitted a thunderous sound and a flash of fire. Whether they killed or merely frightened, their noise startled horses unused to such things. Riders fought to control them, curses rising over the din. Still, discipline held. The Mamluk horsemen regained control, reformed their lines, and continued firing. The Mongols, seeing no break, withdrew slightly, regrouping for another pass. Hours seemed to stretch inside that exchange. No major charge yet, no decisive move, just the grinding contest of endurance. Men's hands blistered from drawing bowstrings, lips cracked under the sun, horses foamed at the mouth, nostrils wide, eyes rolling. And through it all, neither commander blinked. Kitbukha rode along his ranks, his face calm beneath the iron helmet. He had fought in colder lands, in higher mountains, against armies larger than this. He saw the Mamluks' discipline and acknowledged it with a nod to his aides. They were better trained than he expected, but he still believed he would break them the same way he had broken everyone else. On the other side, Qutuz studied the Mongols through a narrow slit in his visor. He knew the moment of deception was near. The plan demanded that his front lines appear weak, not too quickly, not too obviously, but just enough to invite pursuit. He gave Baybars a brief nod. The signal was passed down the ranks. Slowly, the front line began to yield. Step by step, the Mamluks started falling back toward the center of the valley. To any observer, it looked like retreat. Mongol scouts reported the movement to Kitbukha, who smiled beneath his helmet. The trap seemed to have sprung itself. He ordered the center to advance. Drums boomed. The Mongol crescent began to close. Arrows darkened the sky once more, and the space between the two armies shrank to a mere few hundred meters. But the Mamluk fallback was controlled. Each line withdrew in turn, shields facing backward, archers shooting over their shoulders even as they moved. They were not fleeing, they were guiding. Step by step, they drew the Mongols deeper into the valley, closer to the ridges where Qutuz's hidden reserves waited unseen. By midday, the battlefield was a haze of heat and dust. The roar of men and beasts rolled over the plain like distant thunder. The Mongols pressed harder, sensing victory. The Mamluks kept falling back, inch by inch, their discipline masking the precision of the maneuver. Above it all, the sun burned white. No one spoke of victory or loss, only survival. The next few moments would decide everything. The Mongols advanced, convinced the enemy was breaking. Their confidence was the same that had carried them across half the world. Kitbukha's orders were crisp and certain. Close the gap, press forward, finish them before they regroup. His banners moved like shadows across the dust, black horses pounding the earth in perfect unison. The Mamluks fell back another 50 paces, firing as they moved. Their arrows struck with deadly accuracy. Small clusters of Mongol riders tumbled from their saddles, but the horde came on relentlessly. The Mongols' hooves churned the valley floor to powder. The noise was deafening, a single rolling thunder that swallowed every voice. Baybars watched the center begin to buckle. This was the moment he had prepared for. He sent a runner to Qutuz. A brief message carried through the chaos. The net is ready. Along the ridges to the north and south, thousands of Mamluk cavalry waited, motionless, their armor dull with dust, horses trembling beneath them. They had been silent for hours, every man listening for the signal that would release them. Beneath the hum of arrows and the pounding of hooves, they could hear their own heartbeats. Then it came, a single sharp blast of a war trumpet rising above the chaos. It was Qutuz's call. From both flanks, the Mamluk reserves surged down the slopes at full gallop. Their war cries tore through the valley. The Mongols had no time to react. They turned in shock as the Mamluk wings struck their sides with crushing force. The trap closed instantly. The first impact was brutal. The sound of steel on steel, the shriek of horses colliding headlong, men thrown from saddles as lances splintered and curved blades flashed. Dust rose in clouds, blinding both sides. At this distance, bows were useless. It became hand-to-hand combat, sabers, maces, daggers, and sheer strength. A Mongol horseman swung his axe into a Mamluk's shield. The Mamluk countered with a downward cut that split helm and skull. Another pair locked arms and fell from their mounts, wrestling in the dirt until a third rider trampled them both. The valley that had been silent hours earlier was now a living storm. The Mamluk heavy cavalry showed its worth. Their armor, thicker and heavier than the Mongols, turned many of the glancing blows. Their lances, nearly 3 meters long, punched through leather and mail. Some carried spiked maces that shattered ribs through armor. Each rider had trained for years to fight as a single moving wall, to hold formation, even when the world disintegrated around them. Baybars led from the left flank, cutting a path through the Mongol wing. He directed his men with precision. No wild pursuit, only steady pressure, forcing the Mongols inward toward the valley center, where Qutuz's line waited. On the right, the Mamluk archers continued to fire even as they advanced. They had switched to shorter, lighter arrows for close range. Every shaft found a target: horses, necks, joints between armor plates. Their fingers bled from the string, but they did not stop. The Mongols, though surprised, did not collapse immediately. Their discipline was iron. They wheeled their horses in small groups, forming tight circles, firing in all directions. Their short bows allowed them to shoot backward while retreating, a skill that had destroyed armies before. But here, the terrain betrayed them. The valley's slopes funneled them into a narrowing space. The Mamluks on the ridges poured down like water from two sides, cutting off escape routes. Kitbukha rode among his men, striking with his sword, shouting for them to hold. His standard, a black horsetail banner, was still visible through the haze. To many Mongols, that sight meant the fight was not lost. They clustered around it, fighting desperately. At the center, Qutuz saw the moment he had waited for. The Mongol line was bending under pressure, but not yet broken. If it stabilized, the trap could fail. He spurred his horse forward, tearing off his helmet so his men could see him. "Warriors of the Nile, forward," he shouted. He led the charge himself. The Mamluks around him surged after him, a mass of armored men and horses slamming into the Mongol front. The impact sent riders flying. Qutuz fought in the thick of it, striking at any rider who came within reach. His sword, a straight Damascus blade, flashed through the dust, his movements deliberate and brutal. Those near him would later say that moment changed the fight. The sight of their sultan at the front gave every Mamluk new strength. The shouts of Allahu Akbar rolled across the valley. For the first time, The Mongols hesitated. The trap had closed fully now. Their wings were being squeezed, their center driven back toward the stream that cut the valley floor. And then came the sound that few had heard before on a battlefield. A deep, cracking roar that echoed off the hills. Some men thought it was thunder. Others said it was the earth itself groaning. In truth, it was the blast of the midfa, the hand cannon. Arab sources record that the Mamluks may have used these early gunpowder tubes at Ain Jalut. The devices were crude, a short bronze or iron cylinder packed with saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, fired by applying a slow-burning match to a vent. The explosion produced a burst of flame and smoke, hurling a small iron ball, or simply startling horses and men unused to such noise. Whether they killed or not, the effect was psychological. Horses reared, Mongol formations wavered, and for a moment the rhythm of their counterattack faltered. The Mamluks seized that moment. Baybars ordered his right wing to close tighter, cutting off the last gap on the northern slope. The Mongols found themselves compressed into an ever smaller space. The sound of steel, the screams of men, the shouts of commanders blurred into a single, terrible chorus. But Kitbukha still stood firm. His personal guard fought like men possessed, their horses foaming, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. They struck down several Mamluk officers trying to reach him. He was a warrior of the old steppe, and even surrounded, he refused to fall back. By early afternoon, the valley was a furnace of movement. The air shimmered with heat, arrows lay like reeds on the ground, and bodies, Mongol and Mamluk alike, formed mounds in places where the fighting was fiercest. Yet neither commander gave the order to withdraw. Qutuz's horse had been killed under him once already. He mounted another and pressed forward again. Baybars had a gash along his arm but ignored it, rallying the men with his voice more than his sword. The Mongols, though encircled, kept breaking out in small bursts, groups of 20 or 30 riders slashing their way through before being cut down. No one on either side knew how long they had been fighting. The sun stood high, casting no shadow, and the noise had become endless. Still, the battle was not yet decided. The Mongols were wounded, but not broken. They had fought their way out of worse traps before. Kitbukha's banner still flew in the center, defiant, the black horsetail whipping in the wind. The Mamluks tightened their circle. Qutuz raised his sword toward the enemy's standard. He could see Kitbukha now through the dust, a tall figure on a chestnut horse, blood on his face, his armor glinting with golden iron. Around them, men kept dying, unaware they were standing at the turning point of an age. The outcome still hung in the balance. One last push, one mistake, one heartbeat could decide whether the Mongol Horde would roll onto Egypt or break forever on this valley floor. And so, as the afternoon sun blazed overhead, both armies paused, only for a breath, the smallest hesitation, before the storm came again. For a heartbeat, both sides were frozen in that haze of heat and exhaustion. The Mongols stood locked in the center of the valley, surrounded on three sides, their horses breathing hard, foam and dust clinging to their coats. The Mamluks, tightening the ring around them, steadied for the final exchange. The sound of clashing steel had dulled into a rhythm, slow, grinding, merciless. Then Kitbukha raised his sword. The blade caught the sunlight and flashed once, a signal to every Mongol still standing. The trumpets blared again, long and defiant. His men answered with a cry that rolled across the valley like a wave. The Mongol countercharge had begun. They moved as one body, the compact core of what had once been the Horde. Their horses surged forward, heads low, nostrils wide. Arrows flew again, not in massed volleys but in close, desperate bursts. They crashed into the Mamluk center with the force of men who knew retreat meant death. The shock rippled through Qutuz's line. Men and horses staggered. The Mamluk shields held for only a moment before buckling under the pressure. For the first time that day, the Mongols punched a hole through the formation. A handful of their riders broke through, cutting deep before the ranks closed behind them. Baybars saw the breach and reacted instantly. He led his personal guard, 200 of the best-trained cavalry in Egypt, straight into the gap. They slammed into the Mongol wedge from the side, the impact throwing men from their saddles. Steel rang against steel, hooves struck armor, and the air filled with the sound of human effort. The grunts, the shouts, the choking gasps of men locked in combat too close to breathe. Qutuz saw it too. His helmet was gone, his face streaked with blood and sweat, but his eyes burned clear. He spurred his horse forward, calling to the troops around him. "Close ranks! Forward! Do not yield!" The words carried through the dust. To his men, his presence meant the line had not broken. They rallied around him, tightening their formation, pressing back against the Mongol wedge. For Kitbukha, this was the moment he had sought all day, the chance to reach the enemy commander and strike the heart. He drove toward Qutuz with a dozen of his personal guards, cutting through the chaos. The distance closed quickly. Arrows hissed past Qutuz as he raised his shield. The Mongols bore down, their small horses darting through the gaps, sabers flashing. One swung for his head. Qutuz leaned low and struck the man across the chest, sending him tumbling. Another rider lunged with a spear. The tip grazed Qutuz's arm but did not pierce. His bodyguards swarmed around him, blades rising and falling in rapid arcs. Kitbukha's charge met them head-on. For an instant, the two commanders were separated by only a handful of men. They could see each other through the dust. Two figures shaped by war, neither willing to yield. Then the tide shifted. From the southern ridge, another column of Mamluk cavalry appeared. Reinforcements held in reserve for precisely this moment. They thundered down the slope, striking the Mongols' exposed rear. The encirclement was now complete. The Mongols fought like trapped wolves. They turned their mounts to face each new threat, forming small circles and shooting outward. Arrows glanced off shields and armor. Horses screamed as they went down. The ground turned slick beneath hooves. Baybars' men pressed harder, cutting off their retreat to the north. The valley filled with noise, shouting, metal, the dull thud of weapons meeting flesh. Amid it all, Kitbukha's banner still flew, black against the white sun. One by one, the standards around it fell. His captains were cut down. His guard, once 1,000 strong, was reduced to a few dozen. Yet still he fought, his sword flashing, his commands clear. Witnesses later said his voice carried even above the din. He refused to fall back, refused to flee. The Mamluks admired his courage, even as they closed in. Some hesitated to strike him directly, others did not. A blow from a mace shattered the leg of his horse. Kitbukha hit the ground, rolling to his knees, swinging wildly at those who came too close. Two Mamluks dismounted to seize him, but he struck one down before the other caught his arm. They wrestled briefly, Kitbukha's strength undiminished by exhaustion. When he was finally overpowered, he stood tall, breathing hard, his armor dented and blood-streaked, but his eyes steady. He was brought before Qutuz amid the chaos. The two men faced each other without words at first. The conqueror of empires and the slave-turned sultan who had stopped him. The noise of battle faded around them. Kitbukha broke the silence. "If you are king," he said quietly, "do as kings do." He would not kneel. He would not beg. Qutuz gave a nod. The execution was carried out quickly. Kitbukha fell without a sound. The men who saw it would remember his defiance for the rest of their lives. The Mongols around him, realizing their leader was gone, began to waver. The tight formations that had held so long started to dissolve. Their arrows slowed, their countercharges faltered. Still, the fighting did not end at once. Pockets of Mongols continued to resist, some breaking through the lines only to be hunted down by light cavalry. The Mamluks fought on methodically, no longer desperate but determined. Qutuz rode back along the ranks, calling for order. "Do not chase! Hold your lines!" he shouted. He knew too well the Mongol habit of feigned retreat. Even in victory he feared an ambush. Baybars' troops fanned out across the valley, driving the last Mongol detachments toward the stream. There, in the shallow water, men and horses struggled, armor dragging them down. Arrows hissed over the surface like insects. The afternoon wore on. The sun began to tilt westward, the light thickening to amber. The dust started to settle, revealing the scale of the carnage. Thousands of bodies, tangled horses, broken lances, a field of silence after hours of chaos. But the battle itself was not yet fully decided. Some Mongol units, scattered but unbroken, were still fighting their way toward the northern hills. Qutuz ordered pursuit only when he was certain the valley was secure. The drums beat once more, this time slower, a sound of endurance, not triumph. The Mamluk banners moved forward through the smoke, advancing carefully. Every few yards they passed the fallen, Mongol and Mamluk alike, lying side by side, their armor indistinguishable under the dust. Above them, the last remnants of the Mongol Horde gathered around what remained of their banner, refusing to surrender. They drew together, forming one final knot of resistance near the edge of the field. Qutuz watched them from a distance. He knew what it meant. Warriors fighting for honor when defeat was certain. He respected that, yet he could not let them escape. He raised his sword again, signaling for the last encirclement. The Mamluks began to close in, silent except for the clinking of armor and the heavy breathing of horses. The air was still, the heat immense, and the end near. But not yet. The valley of Ain Jalut, once green and quiet, now bore witness to the moment when history bent. The last Mongol knot held for minutes that felt like hours. They were surrounded now on all sides, pressed against the rising slopes of the valley. Smoke drifted over the field, the smell of sweat, iron, and blood hung heavy in the heat. The Mamluks advanced in a slow arc, shields raised, spears leveled. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft groan of armor and the low whimpering of horses too wounded to rise. Then, with a sudden cry, the trapped Mongols charged for the last time. It was not a coordinated attack. It was defiance. They rode straight into the wall of Mamluk lances, striking with every ounce of strength left in them. Some reached the front rank, swinging axes and sabers until they fell beneath the crush of men and steel. A few broke through, only to meet the reserve cavalry waiting beyond. When the dust settled again, the banner of Kitbukha was gone. His guard lay where they had stood. The surviving Mongols tried to flee north toward the hills of Galilee, but Baybars had already sealed the exits. His light cavalry swept around in wide arcs, cutting off the escape routes and driving them back into the trap. By late afternoon, organized resistance ceased. The field was littered with broken bows, shattered shields, and the bodies of men who hours earlier had believed themselves invincible. The Mongol army, that moving symbol of fear that had darkened continents, was no more. But for the Mamluks, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. Their armor was dented, their faces black with dust. Many had lost friends, brothers, or horses they had raised from foals. Some dismounted silently and walked among the fallen, searching for familiar faces. Others sat in the shade, heads bowed, too tired even to drink. Qutuz rode to the highest point in the valley, overlooking what was now a graveyard. The sun hung low, red through the haze. He removed his gauntlets and ran his hand through his sweat-matted hair. Around him, the officers gathered, Baybars among them, his arm bandaged, his eyes hollow. They did not cheer. They stood in silence. The chroniclers who came later would write of the victory, of the triumph of faith over conquest, but those who were there remembered only the stillness that followed, the quiet that comes after thunder. The valley that morning had been alive with sound. By evening, it was silent except for the cawing of crows circling above. Qutuz ordered the dead to be buried at once. The Mongols were laid in separate pits, their armor stripped and stacked for inspection. The Mamluks buried their own with prayers, facing Mecca. The work lasted through the night, torches flickering against the dark. The sound of shovels and murmured recitations filled the air like a low chant. By dawn, the smoke had drifted away. The survivors gathered for the morning prayer. They washed the blood from their faces with water from the stream that ran through the valley, the same stream that had once been called the Spring of Goliath. For centuries, people would say that another giant had fallen there. The Mongols who escaped, perhaps a few hundred at most, fled north toward Damascus. They carried word of Kitbukha's death and the destruction of his army. When news reached Hulagu Khan in Persia, his fury was immense. He swore revenge, but internal strife in the empire and the long distance between his forces and Egypt meant that promise would never be fulfilled. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol advance had been stopped. Not by mountains, not by plague, but by men who refused to yield. Ain Jalut became more than a battle, it became a symbol. In Cairo, when word of victory arrived, the city erupted in disbelief. People flooded the streets, praising God, lighting lamps and offering food to strangers. The Mamluks had saved not only Egypt, but the Islamic world from annihilation. The fall of Baghdad had shown what failure looked like. Ain Jalut showed that resistance was possible. In the days that followed, Qutuz reorganized his forces. He ordered the captured Mongol weapons collected and examined. Among them were hundreds of composite bows, quivers, and horse armor of intricate design. The few surviving Chinese siege specialists left behind confirmed what rumors had whispered, that the Mongols carried barrels of black powder, the ingredients of thunder that would, in time, change warfare forever. For now, though, the field of Ain Jalut remained quiet. The birds returned. The stream ran clear again. Grass would grow over the scars left by hoofprints and graves, but the memory would not fade. Baybars rode beside Qutuz as the army began its march home. Neither man spoke for a long time. Finally, Baybars said, they thought the world belonged to them. Qutuz nodded. And today, they learned it does not. There was no triumph in his voice, only the weary understanding of a man who had seen too much death to call any victory sweet. He knew the Mongols would return in smaller waves. He knew that power invited envy and betrayal. But for this moment, Egypt was safe, and the myth of Mongol invincibility had ended. Behind them, the soldiers marched in silence, leading the captured horses. The banners moved slowly in the morning light. From a distance, the army looked smaller than it had when it entered the valley, yet heavier, as if it carried not weapons now, but history itself. When they reached Damascus, the people lined the streets. Merchants threw coins from balconies, children shouted, and clerics wept openly. The Sultan rode at the head, bareheaded, his sword laid across his lap. Baybars followed beside him, the two men united by the memory of what they had done together. Weeks later, Qutuz would be killed on the road back to Cairo, betrayed by his own officers, some say at Baybars's urging, but the victory at Ain Jalut endured beyond either of them. It became the foundation of the Mamluk Sultanate's strength, a reminder that discipline and unity could defeat even the greatest empire on earth. In the years that followed, Mongol raids continued, but never again with the same momentum. The tide that had carried fire from China to the Mediterranean had reached its edge and broken upon a narrow valley in Galilee. Centuries later, the name Ain Jalut would still carry meaning. Historians would argue over numbers, whether 15,000 Mamluks faced 12,000 Mongols, whether gunpowder had truly been fired that day. But none would dispute its importance. It was the moment when the unstoppable was stopped, when courage and preparation met terror and overcame it. Standing in that valley today, surrounded by the green hills and the whisper of the wind through the grass, it is hard to imagine the noise and fury that once filled it. The land gives no sign of what it saw, but every stone, every blade of grass, lies over the memory of that September day in 1260, when the world's greatest army met its first defeat, and the course of history quietly changed.